Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, request that proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, there have been now two speakers on the floor this afternoon speaking to House Joint Resolution 69, which is the disapproval resolution on Alaska Fish and Wildlife Refuge rule. And I have come today to speak in strong support of this resolution, which will effectively overturn a rule imposed by the previous administration related to fish and wildlife management on millions of acres of refuge land in the state of Alaska. I'd like to start my comments by acknowledging both Senator Sullivan for his lead on this initiative and for Congressman Young as he moved this measure through the House just a couple weeks ago. What we saw within the House measure and the final vote was a bipartisan vote that secured passage through the House, and I thank Congressman Young for his able leadership there. I also want to thank Senator Sullivan for his comments and really doing an excellent job in outlining and explaining why this Fish and Wildlife Service rule is bad for Alaska, bad for hunters, bad for our native peoples, bad for America. And like my friend and colleague, I'm here to encourage members of the Senate to see this rule for what it really is. It is a departure from federal law, a clear departure from federal law. It is an unwarranted regulatory overreach, and from all accounts, it is a direct attack on states' rights. Now, we will have discussion back and forth on the floor about various hunting practices, and we will see beautiful shots of wildlife and suggestions that somehow or other this is about a specific hunting practice. This is bigger than wildlife refuge in the state of Alaska. This is an issue that is not just isolated or contained in the state of Alaska. This resolution is specific to Alaska. But, Mr. President, I would suggest to you that for all those of us who care about states' rights, who care about the promises made to our states about how they operate, how they manage activities on their states, this is something that we must all pay attention to, because this is a direct attack on states' rights. I look at this and would suggest that this rule is a solution in search of a problem. And again, for those who would say, why is the Senate spending 10 hours to debate practices within a refuge in the state of Alaska? Is this not just so parochial an issue that it ought not to take our time? But I would contend that this foreshadows what is in store for the rest of the country if we are not adamant in ensuring that this rule that has been laid down be now repealed by Congress. Now, for those who may not be familiar with Alaska or game management laws within our state, within our national wildlife refuges in general, I think it's important to cover some basic facts, perhaps a little bit of history here, to illustrate why this rule is so flawed. Alaska, like every other state in the nation, holds primary legal authority to manage its fish and its wildlife, including on federal refuge lands. So let's not get confused here and think that because you have federal lands that somehow or other the states do not have primacy here when it comes to management of its fish and wildlife. Alaska holds legal authority to manage the fish and wildlife within its borders. This is clear, this is unambiguous. Congress explicitly provided that authority to our state in not only one, not two, but 3 separate laws. First was the Alaska Statehood Act, and then also the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, and the third authority was through the National Wildlife Refuge System Administration Act. So in 3 separate authorities, Congress made clear, Alaska, you are to manage the fish and wildlife within your borders. So this is pretty clear. Our Statehood Act gave Alaska the right to manage its fish and its wildlife as soon as the state could assemble a Department of Fish and Game. We actually did that in the first year of statehood. And then in 1980, ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, affirmed twice that nothing within its text was, quote, intended to enlarge or diminish the authority of the state of Alaska for management of fish and wildlife on the public lands. So again, very clear, not only within the Statehood Act, but within ANILCA, very clear that management would be left with the state. The authority to manage our fish and our wildlife through decisions that are based on sound science and that make sense for our local communities. This is something that we in Alaska take very, very seriously. For us, state management of fish and wildlife is practically sacrosanct. And I cannot emphasize that enough. It's one of the key reasons that the state of Alaska voted to join the union. And so we've got pretty good reasons for the emotion, the passion that comes with this authority to manage, again, our fish and our wildlife. I am proud to acknowledge that not only am I the first senator to serve in the Senate who was born in Alaska, I was actually born in the territory. My parents, my grandparents were engaged in the battle for statehood, and some think it was about the land. For most of the discussion that I recall from my family, it was all about fish. It was all about salmon. That was one of the reasons that we fought for statehood, was management of our fisheries. The federal management of Alaska salmon fisheries prior to statehood was absolutely appalling. Salmon stocks falling from 113 million in 1934 to just 25 million in 1959. And that management that we saw from the federal side, that experience left Alaskans absolutely committed to state management and to the preservation of both fish and game. So we negotiated that for ourselves. And we put that in law. We enshrined it in law in several different places. And we expect our federal agencies to abide by that. That was the terms of the deal when we entered the union as a state. Alaska is to manage the fish and the wildlife within our borders. It's our right and our responsibility, and we take that responsibility very seriously. We have an entire Department of Fish and Game that is dedicated to it, and as Senator Sullivan rightly noted, a department that has been recognized for the good work that they do, the strong science that they utilize, and we are proud of the efforts that they make to ensure that this management is done for sustained yield, the principle that we stand by in our state's constitution. And so for decades now, we've done just that, up until the National Park Service in 2015, and then Fish and Wildlife Service in 2016 took it upon themselves, these agencies did, to propose regulations to take that control away from Alaska, despite what was contained in our statehood agreement, in ANILCA, and in the National Wildlife Refuge System Administration Act. Now, the National Park Service's rule is outside the reach of the Congressional Review Act. So while, in my view, that also deserves repeal, it's not the focus of the debate that we have here today. Instead, the resolution that we're discussing focuses on the Fish and Wildlife Service rule, which was finalized over the protests of Alaskans in August of last year. And the rule itself was packaged perhaps innocently enough. The Fish and Wildlife Service spoke of clarifying existing mandates for conservation and biological diversity. And the agency claimed that it was outlining a few methods of predator control, couched its rule as a victory for public participation, and then promised us that it did not change federal subsistence regulations or impose new regulations on subsistence users. So on the face of it all, it sounded like it was going to be not so bad if you take the agency's description at face value. And so for many who are outside of Alaska who are looking at this, they're saying, you know, why are you making such a big deal about all of this? Department of Interior is just clarifying some hunting rules, so it can't be that big of a deal. But the answer is wrong on that. It is a big deal. It is a big deal. Now, some of the opponents will allege that the repeal of this rule will legalize brutal predator control practices. But what the Senate should know is that it is already illegal for hunters to use certain practices, gas against wolves, traps to bears. You can't do this in national wildlife refuges in Alaska. So those arguments are false and unfortunately serve mostly to distract from what the rule is really about. And as I mentioned at the outset of my comments, what this is really about is the state's rights, the state's authority, and effectively state control. So first and foremost, I am here to defend the right of my home state and of all of the states to manage fish and game within their boundaries. The game management rule severely erodes the authority of Alaska to make these decisions, and I think it sets a terrible precedent for the other 49 states. If you think that this rule is just Alaska only, this is not something that I need to worry myself about. You should be worried. You should be worried if you have federal lands within your states. Your state could be the next one where Fish and Wildlife Service comes in and says, nope, it's not going to be you, state, that has this management authority. We're going to come in and tell you what can and cannot be done. The Fish and Wildlife Service freely admits that its rule will impact 54 million acres of refuge land inside the state of Alaska. This is an area that's 10 times larger than the size of the state of Massachusetts. So this is not insignificant. And really, this is truly the camel's nose under the tent. If Congress allows this rule to stand, it will effectively override U.S. Supreme Court rulings from 1896 and 1979, which held that the states have the power to, quote, protect and conserve wild animal life within their borders. The state's power in this area is subject only to specific federal authorities articulated by Congress, such as the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So the precedent being set for Alaska and every other state out there should be sufficient reason for us to oppose this rule. But I also need to speak to some of the particulars included within it, especially the Obama administration's claim that it would not change or restrict subsistence uses. This regulation made significant and substantive changes to regulations related to the hunting of bears. And while I realize that everyone out there may not agree with hunting, but I would urge you to listen to what my colleague from the state of Alaska said in his comments, what he outlined in terms of subsistence to Alaska Natives, subsistence to those who are in, it's so remote, rural is not even the right way to describe it. We call it bush Alaska, where there are no stores, there's no Safeway, there's no Whole Foods, there's no stop and go. There is no place where you can go to get your meat, to get your fish. In many areas, there just isn't even a store, much less a store where you can can go and buy some hamburger helper or whatever it is that you're going to provide for your family. That model just doesn't exist in certain parts of our state. And so what the people who live there do is they hunt. That's how they provide for their families. They hunt and they fish and they gather, and that is subsistence. And that subsistence is not only nutritional sustenance. For many, it is also their cultural identity, whether you are the people of the caribou or the people of the whale, the salmon people, the native people who have been part of this corner of the world for millennia, relate to their food source. And making sure that not only their traditional diets can continue, but how they are able to practice this subsistence lifestyle, how they are able to do that matters greatly. And Mr. President, the regulation that we're talking about today jeopardizes many of those Alaskans' ability to sustainably harvest wildlife, to hunt, to feed themselves and their families. And so when we think about the Alaska model of management and how it works to achieve healthy populations, this rule that we're dealing with right now upsets that balance. It makes significant changes to the types of activities that are allowed when hunting bears without the support of the state or the traditional user groups. In updating regulations governing public notice and participation, the rule eliminates the tools and obligations necessary for meaningful engagement with affected Alaskans. It curtails the use of local knowledge and insights for refuge management, and it relies on an arbitrary and unscientific interpretation of the agency's national biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health policy. The sustainability of Alaska's ecosystem depends on good, sound management, expert management of fish and game populations. But under this regulation, well-established best practices employed by wildlife management professionals are more vulnerable to what could be unscientific or certainly bureaucratic second-guessing, and that has sweeping implications for wildlife populations and for those who depend on them. And if left in place, what would happen is this rule will be applied to the entire refuge system, either unilaterally or through litigation, placing our nation's fishing and hunting traditions at even greater risk. Those who actively participate in the sustainable management of our nation's fish and wildlife populations understand the dangers presented by this rule, and they are overwhelmingly opposed to it. Senator Sullivan mentioned a list of the organizations that have voiced their support. I won't repeat many of the names, but it includes the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which represents all 50 states. It includes subsistence users, guides, outfitters, tourists, hunters, and anglers throughout the country. Dozens of the conservation groups from the Alaska Outdoor Council and the Alaska Professional Hunters Association to Ducks Unlimited, Safari Club, National Rifle Association, Boone and Crockett's. You know, when you've got a coalition that is this strong, that is this broad against a federal rule, you know that something went terribly awry with it. So I would encourage the Senate to see through some of what I would consider to be misleading arguments that some of the outside groups are making against us, and to really see this rule for what it is. This Fish and Wildlife Service game management rule for Alaska refuges is the very definition of federal overreach. It defies the will of Alaskans while disregarding sound scientific game management principles. It will result in less stable populations of fish and wildlife within our state. It will harm our subsistence users who hunt not for sport, but for their literal cultural sustenance, their nutritional sustenance, and really, again, so much of their identity. So, Mr. President, I, again, want to thank those that have been leading on this issue. This is a bad rule that deserves repeal, and I would encourage all of my colleagues, look carefully at this not just as a rule that is parochial and limited to just Alaska alone, but look to it within the context of what this does and what it says when it comes to states' rights and states' ability to manage fish and wildlife within their own state borders. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.